As a teenager growing up in the late 90s, one of my favorite hobbies was renting videos over the weekends. There was a Blockbuster, of course, but got most of my tapes from a local mom and pop store that was only a few blocks away from my house. They tended to have more of the classic horror films I was after. There were slash films like Halloween and Friday the 13th, but my favorites were always the ancient silent ones. Movies like Nosferatu and the Lon Chaney version of The Phantom of the Opera were at the top of my list. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was a tape I rented so many times. I'm surprised my parents didn't just save their money and buy the damn thing. Repeated viewings of these films resulted in completely bizarre dreams. I won't call them nightmares because they weren't particularly scary, but they had a similar atmosphere to what was shown in the films. Some of these dreams were my brain remembering specific scenes, while others were completely original. These dreams influenced me to watch more and more of these films just to see what kind of surreal images my brain would conjure up next. Unfortunately, I never documented what I envisioned. Over time, these dreams would have blurred together. I can only remember bits and pieces. The only one occasion is crystal clear in my mind. It's probably the clearest recollection of any nightmare that I've ever had. Notice I refer to it as a nightmare. It didn't scare me at the time, but it does now. It started with the ending of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. For those who are unfamiliar with the story, let me give you a brief rundown. It's about a twisted magician named Caligari that uses a sleepwalker named Caesar to kill anyone he chooses. At the end, spoiler alert, it's revealed that the character is telling the story is insane, and that Caligari represents the director of a sanitarium. This is where my brain, or whatever force behind the nightmare, picked up the story. With silent films, they're usually accompanied by orchestral scores or piano compositions. The only music that came with these dreams were random mixes of bells and piano notes without any rhyme or reason with those to their structure. It's the same kind of music that played over the nightmare, but it had much more of a harsh and demanding tone than any other dream I had before. The scene began with Dr. Caligari descending to the flight of stairs. These stairs were completely jagged and unproportional, just much like the stairs seen in the film. He walked down from them what felt like minutes before arriving at the floor with the mangled shadows stretching over it. Despite having no visible light source, he approached a triangular table. Laying on the table was the seemingly deceased body of Caesar, then cut to an extreme close-up on Caesar's face, forcing to stare into his lifeless eyes. The sound of the TV static became louder and louder before it completely drowned out the music. That's when my alarm for the school rang out as usual. I remember being only silently creeped out by it, especially by how vivid it felt. Nevertheless, I was prepared for school and eventually forget about it. It wasn't until that weekend where that it began creeping its way back to my conscious. That weekend, my cousin Jacob spent the night in their house. He was my age, and since my aunt was okay with it, my mom encouraged me to rent a movie from the video store for us to watch. Upon arriving into the store, I wasn't sure if he'd be into the same kind of movies as me, so we'd pick up A Nightmare on Elm Street. Since our parents made plans for him to spend the night the next weekend, I thought it wouldn't hurt to at least try to introduce himself to these silent films. He seemed open to the idea, so I strolled over to the shelf where the usual copy of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was available. What caught me off guard was a completely different version. Most silent films, including Caligari, was in the public domain, meaning that any company that put out their own copy without facing legal trouble. This copy didn't look too out of the ordinary when compared to other silent films, so I just assured that the owners of the store would replace the old copy with the newer one. However, this theory felt incorrect, as the new tape had much more ragged sleeve. My dad was getting impatient, so I hurried to check out the tape. The employee at the court counter who I had seen a million times before, did a quick double tape when picking up the movie. It was obvious that he was expecting to see the other copy being checked out. Nevertheless, he placed the tape into a case and put it into a plastic bag with a Nightmare on Elm Street. I noticed that the label on this tape itself was just Caligari. Again, this doesn't seem out of the too ordinary. I remembered the store also had a copy of Godzilla vs. Megalon that just said Godzilla on the label. The distribution companies were just lazy as usual, right? Watching A Nightmare on Elm Street with Jacob was a lot of fun. We got my mom to make popcorn taste exactly like at the theater. It's probably just loaded with butter and shit, mixed with sodas into crazy concoctions. Jacob seemed to have no problem with scary movies. In fact, he might have been more immune to them, considering that he was more used to the modern ones. He appeared to be enthusiastic to check out the cabinet of Dr. Caligari was all about. I warned him that it was a lot different than what we used to. But he didn't have a problem with that. The tape played out just fine. Jacob was engaged with the film, which surprised me immensely. I almost forgot it was a completely different copy until the film came to an end. When the twist unraveled and the film went to black, I stood to rewind the tape. "Wait, it's not done," Jacob said before I could hit the rewind button on the VCR. What appeared on the screen sent shivers down my spine. It was the scene of Caligari's descending to the stairs. "What the hell?" I whispered before looking at it over Jacob. His face was blank, as if he were in a trance. Once the shot cut to the close-up on Cesar, Jacob began screeching at the top of his lungs. He flung himself into the back of the couch and violently swung his arms through the air. Our parents rushed in. My aunt relaxed as I shut off the VCR. They began yelling at me, as if I was the one responsible for upsetting him. After my aunt pulled him out of the room, I rewound the tape to the ending scene and showed that there was nothing that should have been caused his outburst. I hesitated, telling him that I witnessed the exact scene in my dream only nights before. I doubt they believe me. Needless to say, my aunt and my cousin didn't return for any more weekend sleepovers. When my dad and I returned the tapes to the video store, I noticed the usual copy of Caligari was sitting there where it always had, as if nothing had changed. My dad asked the owner why they even had bought the second copy, but he swore that he had no idea why it would have been registered into the store. He picked up the tape and took it into the back room. I thought that was the last time I'd ever think about it, but it wasn't. The mystery of the tape nagged me for a long time. Years after the incident, I emailed Jacob and asked if he remembered the movie. He said he vaguely remembered screaming, but that was the extent of it. No luck there. At that same time, websites like eBay became popular, and my curiosity got the best of me. Despite several searches, I could never find the VHS copy of the movie. It just matched the one from that fateful night. Just days before I gave up on the search, I heard that the video store that I rented it from was closing down and selling loads of their old tapes for cheap prices. I figured it's the only chance to reclaim the tape. Alas, it was not the present. The owner said that he had thrown out a lot of the tapes over the years, and that it was most likely lumped within the rest of them. The part of me is that I was glad that it was ceased to exist, but something in the back of my head kept me at the store for a little longer. I picked out some tapes to buy, and that's when I saw the original Caligari tape that I reviewed relentlessly as a teen. I eagerly bought it, and it now sits to my shelf. To me, it's not just a relic from my past, it's a reminder from the most unnatural occurrence I've ever dealt with.